Hello everyone, back here in Laurelhurst Park in Portland, Oregon, the perfect place to start a Finnish language podcast. So in this video I want to completely pull back the curtain on what my Finnish learning process is, what worked and what didn't work, and I'm really going to focus on what worked, just to give you the information directly. So the first thing I tried was Harry Potter, and Harry Potter in the language learning community is known as the Rosetta Stone of languages. And the reason for that is because you already know the story, or at least you know the movies. The book has more information. Actually, I was able to understand some Harry Potter with zero Finnish whatsoever. And the reason for that is because you know the names. And if you lose your place in the story, you can use the names to get your place back. So what I do is I download the Italki. I forgot what the word was in English. Audiobook, Italki. So you download that from Audible. So you're listening to the Italki, and you're following along with the English from Kindle, or you can get the physical print book, whatever you prefer. And you're just following along as they're reading. And of course you're going to lose your place if you have zero Finnish. But then when you get to a part like Herra ja rouva Dursley, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, you know, okay, I'm supposed to be here in the sentence. And then Dumbledore and McGarmiva, who is Professor McGonagall. They did change some of the names, like Snape is Calcaros. But this is my very first process, was following along in Harry Potter. Now there is one caveat to Harry Potter, which I have to give you a little Finnish history lesson on. It doesn't take you all the way. So I don't want you to go crazy and use Harry Potter exclusively for your Finnish learning process. So if you don't know already, you'll probably figure this out soon enough, that Finnish has the written language and the spoken language. And Finnish language learners, they make too much of a big deal out of this. Like some people will say, well, to learn Finnish, you have to learn 2 different languages. They're not really 2 different languages. They have the same vocabulary or similar vocabulary, and they have different grammar rules. But I like to think of kirjakielia and puhukieli as more of a spectrum. Like with pure, no one speaks pure puhukieli and no one speaks pure kirjakieli. So some people will speak half and half. So there's some words like asunto, which is the written word for apartment. In puhukieli, that would be kämppä, but you could say asunto in normal settings. Now, admittedly, I went a little too crazy on Harry Potter, and I used that as mostly my exclusive process. So then, when I got to Portland in December, I met with a Finnish expat here in Portland, Oregon, and we met in a Starbucks and spoke for about 45 minutes, and then she told me that she was translating her spoken language into the written language, kirjakieli, so I could understand. And at that point, it really hit me that, oh, I really need to get out of Harry Potter and switch over to the spoken language. And the reason why there's a spoken language and there's a written language in Finnish was because of Finnish history. So if we go back in time to the 1500s in Finland, which was ruled by the Swedish Empire, Finnish was just a house language, spoken by people in everyday lives, but it wasn't written down. So it was considered an inferior language because it couldn't be used in official government communication, which was all in Swedish. So this language had a pretty low status in society, even though it was spoken by everyone. So Mikael Agricola, who was a bishop, he came along and decided to translate spoken Finnish into a written language. Because Finnish, it had been written down to a very limited extent, but it hadn't been written down to a mass extent. So it was essentially a language that had no written form whatsoever. When you translate a language that has no written form into a written language, you're going to run into a number of problems. So the first problem was there's a lot of different dialects in Finland. And so how do you write a written language? Because there's There's like a children's birthday party nearby me in this park. So how do you translate all these different dialects into a written form? And the answer is you create a compromise between all the different dialects. So this written form that Michael Agricola created was a compromise between all these different dialects. So it was a constructed language that everyone could understand, but no one spoke this language directly. So the Bible has a lot of complicated words, so he had to invent different words that didn't exist in spoken Finnish in order to make this translation of the New Testament work. So that's why there's a kirja kieli and a puhukieli. They're completely separate. And over time, since the New Testament was published in 1548, the spoken language has evolved quite a bit since then. So, for example, Mina Olin, which in kirja kieli means I am, has become maon. Uksi kaksi, 1 and 2, become uks kaks. So the words have been shortened down, some slang has came in. So they're kind of two different languages, but not really, because they share vocabulary, but there's a lot of different shortened verb forms. So I wouldn't get too wrapped up in kirja kieli versus puhukieli. From my experience, it's much easier to learn the written language once you understand the spoken language, but if you focus on the written language first, it becomes much harder later on to learn the spoken language. So start with the spoken language first. Like listen to podcasts. I will have to learn kirja kieli. For example, if I'm ever going to write a carefully worded email to a client, where it would be extremely unprofessional to write an email to a client in the spoken language. So that's an inevitability, right? But think about your company in the English spoken world. There's people in your company who you wouldn't trust to write a carefully worded email to a client. Like when I write an outgoing email to a client, I proofread it 4 to 5 times. I'm taking 25 minutes to compose it. I'm rereading the connotation of every single word. Does this sound condescending? Does the client already know this? Does this come off as angry? So you're really trying to make sure you're saying what you want to say, but also that the message is going to be interpreted properly. So I'm so many years away from constructing a carefully worded email to a client. So I'm just focusing all my efforts on the spoken language right now. So Harry Potter, it was my first process. It kept me interested because I knew the story and I could kind of go into this fantasy world while also learning Finnish. And I got some good vocabulary like hamahaki, spider, Lena, castle, taika salvan, wand, murky, Hagrid and murky, Hagrid's hut, Metsa, forest. Actually, I probably got Metsa well before Harry Potter because Metsa, forest, is very important to the Finnish soul. I'm trying to think of others. Koti Tontu, house elf. Yeah, actually I got Harry Potter right here. So here we have Harry Potter ja Viisaisen kivi, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, ja Harry Potter ja Salaisuuksien cameo, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Salaisuuksien cameo is Chamber of Secrets. So Salaisuuksien, that helped me learn the word for secret. It is interesting that Hagrid actually speaks in puhukieli, so he's like the only character who speaks in the colloquial spoken language, but all the other characters use kirja kieli. So the next process that really worked for me for the spoken language, and I'm so happy I discovered this because I would be so far behind in my studies if I hadn't discovered this. So there's this YouTube channel called Finnished, and it's created by this polyglot, Lotta, who knows 5 different languages, and she understands 30 other languages by using this process. So she learned Spanish and Italian through this process exclusively. And on her channel, she has something like 100 different videos, and they're all only about 3.5 minutes long. So they're short on purpose. And they have dual Finnish and English subtitles. So the process goes like this. You take one of her videos and you watch it from beginning to end, and you watch it over and over and over again, the same video, until you understand 75% of what's in the video. And you can do this as an absolute beginner. You can do this with zero Finnish, watching these videos over and over again, and you will eventually absorb the language. So once you understand 75% of the language, you stop and move on to the next video. And when I started this process back in September of 2022, it took me 60 plus times to watch each video till I was at 75% understanding. And that's extremely tedious. So 60 times 3.5 minutes, that's 240 minutes. That's about 4 hours of video. So one video would take me a whole day to get through. And by the time I got to the second month, it only took me about 37 times to understand each video. So already 1 month later, Finnish was downloading into my soul through this process. Now it's been 9 months since September of 2022. Now I can watch each of her videos only 3 times to understand 75%. Because I already understand the bones of the language, now I just have to integrate some new vocabulary. And they're very interesting videos. They're about Finnish culture, Finnish daily life. There's a video about the Northern Lights. There's a really good house tour video, which was one of the first videos I watched because I'm in the design industry. So I wanted to know all the different names of the rooms. That was the second thing that worked for me. Now the third thing that really worked for me is I took Loda's process and I evolved it into my own process. What's going to happen is you're going to discover your own learning style and you're going to develop your own process. All language learners, they develop their own processes that work best for them. So my process is a derivative of Loda's process on the Finnish channel. And what I do is I'll take a podcast that's about an hour long. So a good example is Rahapodi, which means money podcast. And that's from Nordnet Suomi, the YouTube channel. And they invite on politicians. They talk about the stock market. They talk about cryptocurrency. It's really good for your numbers. Even if you're not super interested in finance, it's really good for numbers and years, which I always had a hard time with, and that really helped me improve. So what I do is I take this podcast and I split it into little segments. And each of these segments I make exactly 7 minutes and 30 seconds long. So I'll start at 0, stop at 7:30. And then I'll watch that same part 4 times in a row. So 4 times 7.5 minutes is half an hour. That way I can keep myself accountable and tell myself I spent half an hour on the language. And then after watching it 4 times, I recalibrate my time. So instead of starting at 0, I'll start at 5 minutes in. So I'll go from 5 minutes to 12.5 minutes. So I'll watch the next 7.5 minute long segment. And then I'll watch 5 to 12.5 minutes 4 times in a row to make another half hour. And then the third time, I'll move over from 5 minutes to 7.5 minutes. So I'll watch from 7.5 to 15 minutes. And it sounds a little complicated because, it's kind of hard to explain, why do you watch exactly 7.5 minutes? Well, because it fits evenly into half an hour. You could do 3 times 10 minutes to make half an hour. But 10 minutes I found to be a little too long. Or you could do 5 times 6 minutes to make half an hour. But 6 minutes, it's a little tedious watching something 5 times in a row. I prefer to do 7.5 minutes 4 times in a row. So then after you go from 7.5 minutes to the 15, then you can go 10 to 17. And then 15 to 22.5 minutes. And then 17.5 minutes to, my math is getting bad, to 25 minutes. So you're constantly creeping the video up so you get more and more information each time you watch, but you're also reintegrating the old information. So each time you watch the video, you're rewatching everything 8 times in a row, but you're creeping forward in the video so you stay engaged, because you always want to be learning new information to keep yourself engaged in the video. You don't want to just keep watching the same thing over and over again. So this is kind of like a sandpaper method, right? You're kind of re-sanding over the language, but also sanding new territory. So this kind of helps me rewatch the same videos, following the same principles in Lotta's Finnish channel, but integrating it into my own system so I can use it to watch financial podcasts or architecture podcasts or building podcasts. I follow the same principle. So the fourth thing that really worked for me was Italki, and it's a platform where you hire private teachers to teach you language. And this is the only way to efficiently get a lot of speaking time in one session. And there's essentially 3 ways to learn a language: speaking, listening comprehension, and reading and writing. And all 3 of them feed into each other, but speaking is by far the most efficient. Like, I always make the most gains after a huge speaking session. So it's quite challenging living in the US and getting a lot of speaking time, but you can pay a private Finnish teacher to give you the speaking time. Now, when you take an Italki lesson, you have to specify to your teacher, I want to learn the spoken language, because by default, they're going to teach you the written language, because the written language is what they learned in school. Like Finnish children, they learn the spoken language first when they're a baby in their house, and then when they go to school, they learn the written language and all the complex grammatical rules. So they're accustomed to learning the written language, so that's what they teach. So you have to specifically ask, I want to learn spoken Finnish. And if you ask for that, they'll give you that. And you could take a Finnish lesson on day 1, but the reality is that those lessons, they're just going to point you to all the resources. So you have to do a lot of work beforehand to make your speaking time the most effective, because otherwise you're just going to spend the whole lesson, what does this mean? What does this mean? How do I say this? And another effective way I've gotten a lot of speaking time is through a Finnish conversation group here in Portland, which I'm very fortunate exists. I'm so happy the organizers set this up. So once a month, I meet with the Finnish expat community here in Portland and speak in Finnish. And that kind of reinforces the whole community, why you learn a language. Like, nothing is worth doing alone. So if you can find a local community of speakers, that just reinforces your why to learn the language quicker and quicker. Because if you're just sitting by yourself in your apartment, just watching videos over and over again, it's going to get old if you don't have people to talk to in Finnish. The 5th thing that really worked for me, and this is going to be a surprise to a lot of people because it's completely outside of the normal language learning process, was learning Russian. And I don't completely understand the mechanism behind it, but I know that when I do a big Russian day, my mind rewires itself overnight, and the next day I'll break through a huge plateau and I'll understand so much more Finnish than I did the day before. I'm also learning Mandarin Chinese at the same time. I've only started a month and a half ago, and Mandarin Chinese is going to a completely different region of my brain than Russian and Finnish are. Russian and Finnish, they keep overwriting each other. Like, when I learn Russian, it overwrites the Finnish in my brain, and then the Finnish has to rapidly rewire itself. And then when I go back to a Finnish day, the Finnish overwrites the Russian in my brain. So my Finnish teacher was explaining this to me, that even though Finnish and Russian are from completely 2 different language families, they have a similar sentence structure. So in my brain, they're stored in the completely same region. So one will completely upset the other and force the other language to rewire itself. Over the past week, I've been having some pretty vivid / terrifying dreams in Russian, and then I'll wake up and I'll have these nonsense sentences, half in Finnish, half in Russian. So I know it's working, right? Because when you dream in a language, that means your brain is rewiring itself. I broke through a multi-month Finnish plateau. Like, I was showing up to the Finnish conversation group, and the teachers were telling me that I was improving, but I didn't feel like I was improving. And then when I started studying Russian and I went back to my Finnish TV shows, I went from understanding 50% of them to understanding 90% of them, just after 1 week of Russian. And I'm not going to recommend that to you. I'm not going to recommend that, hey, go spend like 25% of your time that you would be studying Finnish and study Russian instead, because it only worked for me. I don't know if it's going to work for you. I don't have enough data samples. I don't know if this is a proven system yet. I do know that if I study 3 hours of Finnish and 1 hour of Russian a day, it's better than me studying 4 hours of Finnish a day. It's actually more efficient to put a little Russian into the mix to upset my Finnish soul enough that my Finnish soul says, hey, we really need to rewire itself because this foreign power is coming into my soul. So Russian and Finnish are forming this really great symbiotic relationship in my head, and I might accidentally learn quite a bit of Russian as my Finnish gets better and better. So you might ask, what is my Finnish level right now? So my Finnish level right now, my Finnish teacher just told me that it was A2, even though I haven't completed the entire segment of all the A2 words. Because if you go to my Kieli Koulu profile from Yle, this Finnish initiative to help the immigrants learn Finnish, there's all these boxes with the different levels and all the words you need to know at each level. So there's about 600 or 700 words at each level. So I know 97% of the A1 words, 25% of the A2 words, and then probably 7 to 10% of B1, B2, C1, and C2. So if you add up all the A2 up to C2 words I know, it would fill in A2. So my Finnish teacher told me that I was at A2, even though I'm not quite there yet. So officially I'm not at A2, but I'm rapidly closing in on it. So if you get anything out of this video, your process has to be fun in order for you to show up. There are some processes that are more efficient than others. Sometimes the more efficient processes are less fun. Like for example, watching TV without subtitles. As an absolute beginner, that's very inefficient because you need to learn certain words with a subtitle that can't be inferred through context. So your process has to be fun, and you need to find a community of speakers that you can talk to give meaning and purpose to the language. Otherwise, it's kind of like this just abstract idea of you're learning a very far away language from the other side of the world, and it has no applications to your current life whatsoever, and it's just a hobby. But once you show up to the spoken Finnish community, all of a sudden there's meaning and purpose attached to it. So 2 things, it has to be fun from day one. If it's not fun now, it's never going to be. And 2, you have to connect with a community of like-minded speakers as soon as possible. So if you're a Finnish language learner, comment on this video what worked for you. I'm constantly seeking ways to improve my process. What works for me as an absolute beginner eventually stops working. Every single process reaches a point of diminishing returns. So I have to keep fine-tuning my process. I'm always looking to better myself in terms of my Finnish learning process. So if you have any things that worked for me, please share it in this video, and I'll see you next time. Moi moi.